David Shaw paced quickly through the terminal of New York's JFK Airport, his dark leather shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. He glanced down at his watch, feeling the pulse of a million thoughts converge on one point. The case he was headed to Chicago for, his client's future hanging on the line. And the 20-minute cushion he had left to get through security and reach his gate. The case was monumental, a chance to right a terrible wrong for a community that had trusted him. And it was personal for David. The family he was representing had been through enough, and missing this flight was simply not an option. He exhaled a quick breath, rolled his shoulders, and tried to mentally prepare himself to stay calm through the usual TSA ordeal. When he finally arrived at the security checkpoint, David automatically went through the familiar motions, placing his briefcase on the conveyor belt, removing his belt and shoes, and placing his laptop in a separate bin. The routine didn't bother him. He was a seasoned traveler and knew the drill well. The line moved forward. He felt a flash of relief. So far, so good, he thought, mentally counting down the minutes to his departure. Then a voice cut through the air like a razor. "Sir, could you step over here for a moment?" David looked up, startled, as an airport security agent pointed directly at him. The man was stocky and stern, with a dark uniform that seemed to emphasize his stance of authority. David glanced behind him, half expecting the agent to be gesturing at someone else. But no, it was him. "Is there a problem?" David asked, striving to keep his tone calm. "Just a routine check," the agent replied, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized David. "Nothing to worry about." David nodded slowly, aware of a familiar but unwanted feeling creeping over him. He'd experienced routine checks before, those tense encounters where random selection always seemed to single him out. He felt his chest tighten as he stepped to the side, trying to hold on to his patience. There was no time for resistance. Not now. Another agent joined them, a younger woman who looked somewhat uneasy. She glanced between David and the first agent, clearly sensing the tension in the air. The first agent gave her a brief nod. "We'll handle it from here." "You seem a little nervous, sir," he remarked, his tone laced with suspicion. David held back a sigh. "I'm just in a hurry to make my flight," he replied carefully, aware of every word he spoke. "I have a case to get to in Chicago. It's a tight schedule and every minute counts." The agent's eyes remained fixed on him, unyielding. "Just answer a few questions and we'll get you on your way." David glanced at his watch and felt a prick of anxiety. Time was ticking down fast. He took a breath. "All right, go ahead. What's your destination?" "Chicago," David answered, his voice steady. "Business trip." "Business, huh? What kind of work do you do?" "I'm a lawyer," David replied, watching as the agent's eyes flickered, a hint of curiosity mixing with the suspicion on his face. The agent folded his arms. "Lawyer, you say?" "Yes." David's response was clipped, his patience thinning. He glanced toward the female agent, who avoided his gaze, her unease palpable. "Anything suspicious we should know about?" the agent continued, his tone biting. David's brow furrowed. "I don't see how catching a flight to Chicago could be suspicious. I've been cooperative. I'm following your protocols." "Are there any issues?" The agent's gaze sharpened, and he took a small step closer, his tone hardening. "Look, we're just doing our job here. We have protocols, standard procedure to check for suspicious behavior." David's heart began to pound. He struggled to hold his composure, remembering his years in courtrooms, his ability to stay calm under pressure. But standing here, being questioned for no reason, with his clock ticking down to departure, was testing every ounce of restraint he had. "Suspicious behavior?" David repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Is my behavior suspicious, or am I just trying to make my flight?" A faint smirk danced at the edge of the agent's mouth. "We ask the questions here, Miss Shaw, David Shaw." The agent cocked an eyebrow as he leaned in. "All right, Mr. Shaw, just cooperate, and this'll be over soon. Attitude doesn't help here." David exhaled. his patience wearing thin, but he managed a steady voice. "I'm not trying to make trouble. I'm just trying to board my flight." The younger female agent, whom he could now see had a name tag that read Agent Kim, glanced nervously between him and her colleague. She seemed to be struggling with something, her discomfort evident. David noticed this, holding her gaze for a brief second. She looked away. "Just routine," the agent persisted, as if trying to get a rise out of him. David felt a surge of frustration. "I understand you have a job to do, but I've been answering your questions, so unless there's a reason for this hold-up, I'd appreciate it if I could move on." The agent's face darkened, his tone becoming more clipped. "Like I said, attitude doesn't help. People who cooperate don't usually have such a hard time." David bit his tongue, his fingers flexing at his sides. He glanced once more at his watch. He was dangerously close to missing his flight now. Every second was precious, slipping away as he stood here under the hard stare of a man who clearly had no intention of letting him go anytime soon. "Agent Pierce," David said, reading his name tag. "I know my rights. I've answered your questions. I'm not sure what you think I'm hiding, but I'm simply here to catch a flight. Am I free to go?" Pierce's expression hardened. "Listen, Mr. Shaw, we're here to keep this airport safe. Now, if you don't want to cooperate, we can make this more difficult." David took a steadying breath, the words settling like a weight in his chest. This wasn't about security. This was about power, about being put in his place. He knew it, and somehow, he sensed Agent Pierce knew he knew it. "More difficult?" he repeated, a cold edge to his voice. "You're already making it difficult, Agent Pierce, and this doesn't look like security. It looks like profiling." A tense silence hung in the air. Pierce's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "We don't profile, Mr. Shaw, just a routine check." David kept his gaze level, refusing to back down. "Then let me go, or tell me what, exactly, makes me suspicious." Pierce didn't respond. Instead, he gestured toward the two other security guards nearby, nodding as if to signal something. Within seconds, they had surrounded him, and before David could react, they were leading him away from the checkpoint, his hopes of making his flight evaporating with each step. The murmurs of other travelers filled the air as he was led away, their stares following him. A blend of shock, frustration, and a deep-seated anger simmered in David's chest as he was ushered into a small, windowless room off to the side. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was less a man walking through an airport and more a suspect led in handcuffs. The door clicked shut behind him, and silence fell. David glanced at his watch one last time. His case, his client, his hard-fought chance to bring justice, all slipping away. He clenched his fists, feeling the injustice seep into his bones. In that quiet, cold room, David made a decision. Whatever it took, he wasn't going to let this go. David sat in the small, sterile room, his fingers tapping against the metal table in front of him, trying to remain calm as he waited for whatever came next. The walls were bare, painted a stark white that seemed to amplify the coldness of the space. There was a faint, humming noise from the vent above, but otherwise, the room was silent, isolating. He glanced at his watch again. His flight was boarding now. He'd never make it. That realization settled in his stomach like a stone. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and Agent Pierce entered. He shut the door firmly behind him, then took his time settling down across from David, an unreadable expression on his face. He placed a stack of papers in front of him, as if to add some semblance of formality to the moment. But David could see through the pretense. This was just another opportunity for Pierce to assert his authority. "Thank you for waiting," Pierce said, his tone calm, though there was an underlying sharpness to it. "I hope you understand that this is all routine." David met his gaze, his expression tight. "Routine," he repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. "I've traveled countless times, Agent Pierce. I know what routine looks like. This is something else." Pierce's lips twisted into a thin smile. Well, we have protocols to follow, Mr. Shaw. I'm sure you, as a lawyer, can appreciate that. David took a slow breath. If this is about protocol, then tell me exactly what I've done to raise suspicion, because so far, all I've done is follow every instruction and answer every question. Pierce didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened the folder in front of him and began jotting down notes, as if David's words hadn't registered. After a moment, he looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. Where did you say you were traveling again? Chicago. On business. David's voice was steady, but beneath the calm exterior, his frustration was growing. I've answered that already. Pierce leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. And what type of business do you handle, Mr. Shaw? David clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to snap back. I'm a civil rights attorney. I have a client waiting for me in Chicago. I'm representing them in court. Pierce's eyebrows lifted in mock surprise. Civil rights attorney, that's quite a title. David met his gaze unflinchingly. Yes. And as someone who's well versed in civil rights, I can assure you that I know when my own rights are being violated. Pierce's expression hardened. We're just doing our job here. If you cooperate, this will go a lot smoother. David chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. Cooperate? I've been nothing but cooperative, and yet here I am, in a holding room, missing my flight. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension between them simmering just beneath the surface. It was a battle of wills, and David was determined not to back down, not after the hours he'd spent in this cramped room, not after the looks he'd endured from the passers-by who'd watched him being led away like a criminal. Agent Pierce leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Let's get one thing straight, Mr. Shaw. This is a security protocol. We have no room for attitude here. If you're going to throw your so-called rights around, this will only take longer. David felt a rush of anger at the condescension in Pierce's voice. He opened his mouth to reply, but then he saw Agent Kim, the younger agent from earlier, enter the room. She glanced quickly between David and Pierce, her face showing a mix of tension and discomfort. Agent Pierce, maybe we should wrap this up, she suggested, her voice uncertain but carrying a note of reluctance. She kept her gaze fixed on David, her unease evident. Pierce gave her a look that could have frozen fire. Agent Kim, I'm handling this. If you could kindly stay out of it, I'd appreciate it. Kim hesitated, her gaze shifting back to David. She looked as though she wanted to say something more, but after a moment she fell silent and stepped back, her shoulders tense. Pierce turned his attention back to David. Now, Mr. Shaw, let's go over a few more questions. Where did you say you were staying in Chicago? David felt the last shreds of his patience slipping. I'm staying at the Northside Hotel. I've already provided you with my travel itinerary. There's no need to keep asking the same questions. Pierce's eyes hardened, but he didn't reply. Instead, he glanced down at his notes, scribbling something in a slow, deliberate manner. David watched him, feeling his jaw tighten, his fists clenching under the table. He could see exactly what was happening here. Pierce wasn't gathering information. He was simply exercising control, drawing out the process to make a point. David took a slow breath, forcing himself to keep calm. He couldn't afford to lose his temper here. Not now. Agent Pierce, David began, his tone steady, though his frustration was evident. I understand you're doing your job, but I think we both know what's happening here. There's nothing suspicious about me or my travel plans. I've cooperated fully, and now I'd like to know if I'm free to go. Pierce's mouth twitched slightly. You know, Mr. Shaw, respect goes both ways, and right now I'm not seeing much of it from you. David stared at the blank walls around him, the weight of his missed flight pressing down on him like a heavy stone. He glanced once more at his watch, though the hands on the dial only reminded him of time lost. He knew his client would be waiting in a Chicago courtroom, expecting him to arrive any moment to deliver their final line of defense. And yet, here he was, stuck in a small, soulless room, detained for no reason other than the color of his skin. The door opened again, and Agent Pierce stepped back in, flanked by 2 other agents. This time, Pierce's expression was steely, the smugness in his eyes giving way to a colder resolve. David straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening as he prepared himself for whatever Pierce had planned next. He was done playing games. Pierce cleared his throat. "Mr. Shaw, let me make something clear. This isn't about you or your assumptions about what's happening here. It's about security. It's about protocol." David's eyes narrowed. "I've gone through every protocol you've thrown at me, Agent Pierce, but we both know this isn't about protocol." Pierce's mouth twitched, and for a second, David thought he might finally get a glimpse of the man behind the uniform. But Pierce quickly schooled his expression back into neutrality, crossing his arms with an air of finality. "If you're going to make this difficult, Mr. Shaw, I'll have no choice but to bring you in for further questioning." David clenched his fists, his voice calm but sharp. "Difficult? I've answered every question you've asked. I've followed every instruction. The only thing I'm guilty of is standing here, waiting for a flight I can't even board anymore. I've lost time, a crucial case, and now my patience." Pierce met David's gaze, an unspoken challenge in his eyes. "Then consider this your last chance to cooperate fully, Mr. Shaw, or we escalate from here." David's voice dropped, turning cold and resolute. "You're detaining me without probable cause, Agent Pierce. This is racial profiling, plain and simple. And when this is over, I'll make sure every detail of what you've done is recorded and exposed." For a moment, Pierce's face turned ashen, but he quickly recovered, his expression hardening. "You think anyone's gonna care, Mr. Shaw? Do you know how many complaints we get every day? People whining about being inconvenienced, claiming discrimination just because they don't like the way they were treated." "This isn't inconvenience," David replied, his voice steady and unyielding. "This is harassment." Pierce gave a dismissive snort, but his eyes flickered with something that looked almost like unease. He glanced over at one of the agents beside him, then back at David. "Enough of this," he said, his tone harsh. "Stand up." David didn't move. "On what grounds?" Pierce's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "Failure to comply with security protocol." Pierce's jaw twitched, his smirk fading. "People like you? Always throwing around the word rights like it means something here. Let me tell you, Mr. Shaw, rights don't get you through a security checkpoint. Compliance does." David exhaled slowly, forcing himself to hold his ground. "You can spin this however you like, but I won't back down. When I leave this room, the first thing I'll do is file a formal complaint. This won't end here." Pierce rolled his eyes, a mocking smile tugging at his lips. "File all the complaints you want. People like you don't get far with threats. I'm just following protocol." David looked away, a sense of helpless frustration settling over him. He'd heard those words, just following protocol, used time and time again to excuse unfair treatment, to shield those who hid behind their power. But this time, he was determined not to let it stand. A sudden knock on the door interrupted the standoff, and Agent Kim stepped inside, her expression tense. She looked between David and Pierce, hesitation evident in her eyes. "Agent Pierce," she said quietly. "A word, if you don't mind." Pierce's face twisted in irritation, but he nodded, following her out into the hallway. The door clicked shut, leaving David alone in the cold, silent room. He let out a breath, running his fingers over the metal cuffs around his wrists, the frustration simmering just below the surface. He'd spent his entire career defending those who had been unfairly treated, who had been silenced and dismissed. He knew what it felt like to be stripped of dignity, to be treated like a threat for simply existing. And now it was his turn to fight. Only this time, it was his own freedom, his own dignity on the line. Minutes passed, stretching out in the quiet room as he waited, his patience wearing thin. Just when he thought they'd forgotten about him, The door swung open again, and Pierce stepped back in, his face set in stone. "Mr. Shaw," he said, his voice even. "You're free to go." David stared at him, caught off guard by the sudden shift. "That's it? You're releasing me?" Pierce's lips tightened. "You're free to go," he repeated, his tone clipped. David stood slowly, adjusting his sleeves and glancing at the agent with a pointed look. "I hope you remember this moment, Agent Pierce. Because I certainly will." Pierce's eyes flashed with a hint of irritation, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing David to pass through the door and out into the hallway. Agent Kim was waiting just beyond the doorway, her gaze filled with an apology she didn't voice. David paused for a brief moment, giving her a nod that conveyed both his gratitude and his understanding. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Pierce and the dim, cold room behind him. As he moved through the terminal, David could feel the weight of what had happened pressing down on him. He'd lost his chance to defend his client that day, but he knew he couldn't let this end here. The anger simmered within him, filling him with a fierce resolve. David drove through the city streets in silence, the events of the day replaying in his mind, each moment sharpening his resolve. The hollow ache of disappointment pressed against his chest. He had missed the court hearing, missed the chance to be there for his client when it mattered most. But more than anything, he felt the indignity of his experience. He had been singled out, delayed, and ultimately humiliated. For what? The same protocol excuse he'd heard used countless times to rationalize discrimination. When he arrived at his apartment, David dropped his briefcase by the door and sank into the armchair, staring blankly at the wall. The sting of his helplessness weighed heavily on him, and he knew it wouldn't go away on its own. His mind turned to his law firm, to his colleagues, especially Angela Lewis. Angela had been his mentor since his earliest days at the firm, and he knew she would understand. She was one of the few people who had seen him struggle through similar moments in his career, and her advice had always guided him toward clarity. After a moment's hesitation, he picked up his phone and dialed her number. "David?" Angela's voice was warm but laced with concern. She had clearly seen his missed call from earlier. "What happened? I thought you were supposed to be in Chicago by now." "I was." David paused, collecting his thoughts. "I was detained by airport security. Missed the flight, missed the hearing, missed everything." A silence fell over the line, and David knew Angela was piecing together the implications of his words. "Detained?" she echoed finally. "On what grounds?" "Apparently just existing while black," David replied, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "They questioned me, made me miss my flight, held me in a room for nearly an hour. And there was no cause, Angela. No reason beyond a security agent deciding I looked suspicious." Angela's voice turned steely. "I'm so sorry, David. I can't even imagine how frustrating that must have been. But listen, we're not letting this go. You know that, right?" David exhaled slowly, letting the tension in his shoulders release just a bit. "I know. I already had that thought, actually. I'm tired of seeing this happen. To myself, to my clients, to anyone who doesn't fit someone's narrow idea of normal. This isn't just about me, it's about the principle. It's about making sure people like Pierce don't get away with it." There was a long pause before Angela spoke, her voice laced with determination. "Then let's make sure it's heard. This is more than just another incident. This is a case, and it's going to be one they can't ignore." David leaned back, letting her words settle over him. He'd fought for others countless times, but this time it felt different. It was his own experience, his own dignity he was fighting for. The next morning, David arrived at the law firm early, walking through the lobby with a renewed sense of purpose. He found Angela in her office, already poring over a stack of legal journals. Her desk was cluttered with notes, research files, and casebooks, but she looked up and gave him a knowing nod as he entered. "Glad you're here," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "I've been thinking about strategy." David settled into the chair across from her, folding his hands as he braced himself for what was coming next. "So what's our best move?" Angela leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "We'll file a complaint against the airport security team first. They'll likely dismiss it as a procedural issue, but it will get the ball rolling. Once they respond, we can escalate to a full-blown civil suit if we see any evidence of racial profiling in their past records or if they refuse to admit any wrongdoing. But we'll need to gather proof, and that means requesting every bit of surveillance footage from that terminal. David nodded, the gears in his mind already turning. I want them to know that this isn't just about me, it's about the entire system. We're going to show them that they can't keep hiding behind protocol as a catch-all excuse for discriminatory behavior. Angela's eyes sparkled with a fierce pride. I thought you might say that. And we're also going to need witnesses. The other passengers, maybe the younger agent? What was her name? Agent Kim, David said, the memory of her uneasy expression surfacing. She was visibly uncomfortable with the way Pierce handled things. She might be willing to testify if we can reach her, but she was also hesitant. I think she feels stuck between doing what's right and her loyalty to her job. Angela frowned thoughtfully. Well, we can't pressure her, but I'll see if we can get a statement. Every piece of information counts. They spent the morning drafting a preliminary complaint, meticulously outlining the events as David remembered them, noting every instance of questionable behavior by Pierce and the other agents involved. With each detail, David's conviction deepened. He knew this wasn't just his story, shared by too many others who had suffered similar indignities but had no recourse to fight back. As they wrapped up the first draft, Angela leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. David, you know this will attract media attention, right? Once we start this, there's no going back. David took a deep breath, a calm resolve settling over him. Good. The more attention, the better. If they can't respect people's rights in private, then we'll drag it into the light for everyone to see. Angela nodded, a glint of approval in her eyes. Then let's get ready. We're about to take this public. Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly, gathering every piece of evidence they could find, compiling statements and securing witness testimonies. Word of David's case began to spread through the legal community, and soon enough, a few media outlets caught wind of it as well. Reporters began calling the firm, asking for statements, and online, discussions were already heating up about what his case could mean for airport security and its policies. One morning, as David was preparing to head into another strategy meeting with Angela, his assistant knocked on the door. David, there's a reporter on line 2. Says she's with the New York Tribune and wants a statement. She mentioned your case against the airport. David paused, considering. Part of him wanted to wait until the case was fully prepared before speaking to the press, but he knew the power of public support. If he could get his story out there, others might feel empowered to share their own experiences. Put her through, he said, picking up the phone. A voice crackled on the other end. Mr. Shaw, thank you for taking my call. I'm Aaron Blake with the Tribune. We're very interested in your case and the allegations you're making against airport security. If you're willing, I'd love to hear your side of the story. David chose his words carefully. Miss Blake, what happened to me at the airport wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem, a system that allows people in power to discriminate freely without consequences. I've dedicated my career to fighting injustices, and now I find myself on the other side of that fight. My goal is simple: accountability. I want to ensure that no one else has to go through what I did. He could hear her typing on the other end of the line, and after a moment she replied, I understand. And do you think your case could have a lasting impact? Maybe lead to policy changes in how airport security handles travelers? I hope so, David answered firmly. This isn't just about one incident or one person. It's about ensuring that our institutions uphold the rights they claim to protect. If we can achieve that, then maybe this fight will have been worth it. After a few more questions, Aaron thanked him, and they hung up. David leaned back in his chair, feeling a rush of determination. He knew that sharing his story publicly meant that both support and criticism would come his way. But if this case could challenge a biased system, then every doubt, every harsh word, and every setback would be justified. Angela stepped into his office just as he hung up. Word spreading, David. Your case is all over social media already. People are starting to talk. He nodded, meeting her gaze. Then let's make sure we're ready, because we're just getting started. Angela smiled, a look of quiet pride in her eyes. Then let's give them a fight they'll never forget. They returned to their plans, both of them aware that the road ahead would be long and full of obstacles. But for David, this was more than just a case. It was a cause. And for the first time since he'd walked out of that cold, windowless room at the airport, he felt a sense of purpose and clarity. This wasn't about revenge or compensation. This was about justice. The weeks following David's decision to pursue legal action were a whirlwind. His law firm buzzed with activity, everyone operating at full tilt as they prepared for the lawsuit. There was a palpable sense of urgency in the air, and David could feel the weight of what they were trying to accomplish. This wasn't just about his experience anymore. It had transformed into something larger, a chance to hold an institution accountable for the systemic bias it perpetuated. Angela and David spent hours drafting the official complaint, meticulously cataloging every instance of wrongdoing from the moment he had approached security to the final seconds before his release. They included the invasive questions, the extended detention, the baseless suspicions, all couched under the term security protocol. David wanted this complaint to be more than just a list of grievances. He wanted it to show the ways that unchecked authority could be twisted into a weapon of discrimination. When the document was finally complete, they filed it in federal court under a suite of charges: racial profiling, unlawful detainment, emotional distress, and abuse of power. The suit named not only the airport security agency as a whole, but also Agent Pierce individually, holding him personally accountable for his actions. The day after filing, David sat in his office, feeling the weight of both anxiety and anticipation. The case was now officially public, and the reactions began pouring in almost immediately. News outlets reached out for comments, social media exploded with debate, and even within the legal community, colleagues and friends sent messages of support and warnings. By midday, Angela walked into his office, a folder under her arm, her face grim but resolute. "David," she said, "take a look at these." She handed him the folder, which contained copies of articles and news clippings from across the country. Headlines read, "Civil rights attorney sues airport security for racial profiling. Lawyer files landmark suit against TSA for discrimination and routine screening or racial profiling." Attorney's case raises questions. David scanned the articles, feeling a mix of satisfaction and unease. The story was gaining momentum, and with that came the scrutiny. While many people were rallying behind him, others questioned his motives, wondering aloud if this was just another case of someone playing the race card. He saw comments in online threads filled with dismissive remarks, some accusing him of overreacting, others doubting his account altogether. Angela watched his reaction carefully. The public response is mixed, as we expected. But this is exactly what we wanted, David. The more people talk, the more awareness we bring to the issue, and trust me, the airport and TSA are feeling the pressure. David set the folder down, nodding slowly. "I know. I just hate seeing people dismiss what happened. It makes it harder to stay focused, but I can't back down now." Angela's expression softened. "They're counting on you backing down, David. They're hoping the backlash will scare you off. But they don't know you like I do. You're doing this for everyone who's been ignored and dismissed, and that's why you're going to win." David smiled slightly, her words bringing him a much-needed boost of confidence. But before he could respond, his assistant knocked on the door, holding up a phone. "David, it's Channel 5 News. They want a statement." He paused, then took a deep breath and reached for the phone. "This is David Shaw." The journalist on the other end introduced herself and immediately launched into a series of pointed questions. Did David truly believe he'd been racially profiled? What specific changes was he hoping to see? And did he expect this case to make a difference in how airport security was conducted? David answered each question thoughtfully, choosing his words carefully. "This case is about more than my experience," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "It's about holding those in power accountable. For too long, people have been subjected to undue suspicion and invasive questioning based solely on their appearance. I want this case to set a precedent, a message that racial profiling will not be tolerated, even from those tasked with ensuring our safety. The journalist pressed further. But some people have criticized your lawsuit, saying that security protocols are in place to protect everyone. What would you say to those who believe you were simply subject to a standard procedure? David's gaze hardened. I believe in security. I respect the protocols that keep us safe. But when those protocols are twisted to serve personal biases, they lose their purpose. What happened to me was not about safety. It was about power. And that abuse of power must be addressed. After the call, David sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the battle that lay ahead. The airport security agency had already issued a terse statement claiming that all protocols had been followed and that they did not tolerate discrimination of any kind. But he knew they'd defend themselves vigorously, painting his actions as aggressive and even threatening. He needed more than just his own testimony to win this case. He needed hard evidence. Later that day, Angela called him into her office, her expression serious. David, we've got a lead. I reached out to the airport for the security footage from that day, but they're stalling. They say they'll release it, but we'll need to file a subpoena to force their hand. David felt a surge of determination. Then let's file it. If they're not going to be cooperative, we'll make them. Angela nodded, already gathering the paperwork. We're also working on getting statements from passengers who were around during your detainment. Some of them might have seen how you were treated, and I've been trying to reach Agent Kim. David's interest piqued. Have you had any luck? Angela shook her head. Not yet, but we know she's still working there, so I've sent an official request for a statement. If she's willing to talk, her testimony could make a huge difference. David nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. He remembered the discomfort on Agent Kim's face, the way she had looked away when he was being interrogated. He sensed she had wanted to intervene, even if she felt powerless to do so. If they could get her on their side, it might be the key they needed to turn the tide. The next week, as the case continued to draw public attention, David and Angela found themselves juggling multiple interviews, all while preparing for the first court appearance. Angela arranged a press conference to address the increasing questions from the media, deciding that it was time to lay out their case publicly. On the day of the conference, David stood outside the courthouse. A small crowd of reporters gathered in front of him, cameras flashing as they awaited his statement. Angela stood beside him, her presence calm and steady, a reminder that he wasn't facing this alone. He took a deep breath, then stepped up to the podium, his voice carrying through the courtyard. This lawsuit is about justice, he began, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd. It's about holding our institutions accountable for their actions. No one should be subjected to suspicion and harassment simply because of how they look. This isn't just about my experience, it's about ensuring that every person is treated with dignity and respect. A reporter raised her hand. Mr. Shaw, some people argue that racial profiling is a necessary evil in security. What do you say to those critics? David's expression turned serious. I would ask them, at what cost? How many innocent people must endure humiliation and mistrust before we say enough is enough? We can't sacrifice individual rights in the name of security. True security means protecting everyone's rights, not just those of a select few. Another reporter spoke up. Do you believe this case could lead to policy changes in airport security? David met her gaze. That's exactly what we're hoping for. This case isn't just about one man's experience. It's about changing a system that allows bias to flourish unchecked. We want clear policies in place that ensure accountability and protect against discrimination. The questions continued, each one adding fuel to the fire of the case. When the conference finally ended, David felt a surge of pride. He could see the impact his words were having. The reporters' faces reflected the gravity of his fight, and he could feel the support of those who understood the stakes. Afterward, Angela clapped him on the shoulder, her eyes bright with approval. You handled that perfectly, David. They're going to have a hard time ignoring us now. He smiled, the sense of purpose settling into his bones. Good. That's exactly what I want. They walked back into the courthouse together, knowing that this was only the beginning. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but for the first time since that day in the airport, David felt ready for whatever came next. This was more than just a fight for justice, it was a fight for change, and he was prepared to see it through to the end. The morning sun was just beginning to filter through the blinds of David's office, casting long, slanted rays across his desk piled high with case files and folders. He hadn't been sleeping much these days, his mind constantly churning with strategies, arguments, and the long list of evidence he still needed to obtain. Every day, a new article appeared in the media, each more intense than the last, as public interest in his case continued to grow. Supporters were rallying behind him, sharing their own experiences of airport discrimination, and some even started organizing online in solidarity. But as always, there was the other side, the voices of those who questioned his motives, who labeled him an agitator. Angela knocked lightly before stepping in, carrying her own stack of documents. She looked just as tired as he felt, but her determination was unwavering. "David," she began, setting down the files, "I have good news and bad news. Which would you like first?" David managed a small smile. "Let's start with the good." Angela's eyes brightened slightly. "Well, we finally managed to track down 2 key witnesses who were present in the security line during your detainment. Both are willing to give statements. One of them, Mrs. Grace Thompson, was actually right behind you in line and witnessed the entire ordeal from start to finish. She's already described the interaction as, and I quote, a clear act of profiling." David's spirits lifted at the news. Witness testimonies would be crucial to strengthening his case, especially when facing the tough defense he knew the airport's legal team would bring. "That's fantastic, Angela. What's the bad news?" Angela's face tightened. "The airport has hired Harrison and Lane as their legal representation. I'm sure you remember them." David's stomach sank. Harrison and Lane was a well-known, powerful law firm with a reputation for ruthless tactics, especially in cases where corporate or government interests were threatened. They were known for muddying the waters, discrediting witnesses, and twisting narratives in ways that left plaintiffs feeling helpless and small. Angela continued, her voice edged with caution. "They're going to paint you as aggressive, David. They'll try to say you were uncooperative, that you were the one making things difficult. They're building a case to discredit you personally, so they can dismiss the discrimination claim entirely." David nodded, taking a steadying breath. "I expected as much, but we'll stick to the facts. We have witnesses, and soon, hopefully, we'll have the security footage." Angela's brow furrowed. "Speaking of which, we just received word that the airport's been stalling on handing over the footage. They're claiming it's being reviewed for sensitive information, but my guess is they're hoping we'll get frustrated and back off." David set his jaw, his frustration mounting. "Then we need to push harder. File another motion if we have to. If there's one thing I'm certain of, it's that footage will show Pierce's bias in action. They're hoping we'll fold, but we're not going to give them the satisfaction." Angela gave a resolute nod. "Already on it, and there's something else." She paused, as if weighing her next words carefully. "We finally heard back from Agent Kim." David's heart skipped. He remembered the discomfort on her face during his detainment, the brief but unmistakable looks she had exchanged with Pierce. If anyone from the inside could help corroborate his story, it was her. Angela continued, "She agreed to meet with us off the record, but she's hesitant. She's worried about her job, understandably, but I think there's a chance she might agree to testify if we can convince her that her statement will be protected." David nodded thoughtfully. "Let's set up the meeting. I'll talk to her myself if I have to." The following day, David and Angela arranged to meet Agent Kim at a small coffee shop just outside the city, far from any prying eyes. When they arrived, Kim was already there, sitting in a quiet corner booth with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her gaze downcast. She looked up as they approached, a flicker of nervousness flashing across her face. "Mr. Shaw, Ms. Lewis," she greeted them quietly. David gave her a warm, reassuring smile. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us, Agent Kim. We know this isn't easy." She nodded, her grip tightening on the mug. "Please, just call me Lila." "And?" "I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened to you. I tried to step in, but Pierce, he's been with the agency a long time, he's got connections. I was afraid." Her voice trailed off, and David could see the turmoil in her eyes, the struggle between her loyalty to her job and her sense of justice. He leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Lila, we understand. But I need to know, what was it that made you uncomfortable? Was it just Pierce's behavior, or have you seen this sort of thing happen before?" Lila hesitated, her gaze shifting between him and Angela. "I've worked under Pierce for a few years now. He's strict, to put it mildly, but sometimes he takes things too far. I've seen him single people out, treat them as suspicious for no reason other than—" She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper, "the color of their skin." David's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, letting her continue. "That day when he saw you, it was like he decided right then and there that you were guilty of something. No evidence, no reason. Just because you didn't look like you belonged in a suit, I guess." She shook her head, looking down. "I didn't agree with it, but I didn't know how to stop it." Angela spoke up, her voice soft but firm. "Lila, if you're willing to testify to this, your statement could make a huge difference. We can ensure your protection throughout the process. The truth needs to be heard, and I think you're the one who can help us reveal it." Lila looked up, fear and uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "But I could lose my job, and Pierce, he's vindictive. If he finds out I spoke against him, he'll make my life miserable." David nodded, understanding her concern. "I won't lie, Lila. This is a risk, but if you're willing to stand with us, we'll do everything in our power to support you. You saw the injustice firsthand. This isn't just about me, it's about stopping him from doing this to anyone else." Lila was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. Finally, she exhaled a shaky breath and nodded. "All right, I'll do it. I'll testify. I can't keep watching this happen and doing nothing." A sense of relief washed over David. He reached across the table, offering her a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Lila. This means more than you know." Over the next week, the pieces of David's case began to fall into place. With Lila's agreement to testify, they now had an insider's account of Pierce's behavior and his pattern of profiling. Angela filed an official subpoena for the security footage, forcing the airport to comply under court order. They also gathered statements from the other witnesses, each of whom described seeing David singled out, harassed, and detained without cause. As they built their case, however, the airport's legal team started pushing back harder. Harrison and Lane was relentless, using every tactic in their arsenal to undermine David's credibility. They combed through his background, his case history, even his personal life, looking for anything they could use against him. One afternoon, as David was preparing his notes, Angela knocked on his office door, her expression serious. "David, you need to see this." She handed him a document, a deposition from the airport's legal team, suggesting that David had been uncooperative and hostile during the security screening, twisting his actions to make him appear as a threat. "They're trying to frame this as though you were the aggressor," Angela explained, frustration coloring her tone. "They're using your refusal to stay silent as evidence of hostility." David felt a wave of anger rise within him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "They're trying to make me look like the problem, instead of addressing their own misconduct. This is exactly why I'm fighting this case. They think they can rewrite reality to fit their narrative." Angela's gaze softened. "And that's why we're not backing down. They can twist the story all they want, but we have the facts on our side. Lila's testimony, the security footage, it's all going to come together." David nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "Then let's make sure every angle is covered. They're not just fighting me. They're fighting everyone who's ever been made to feel powerless." As the pretrial hearing approached, the media frenzy around the case continued to grow. Supporters flooded social media with messages of encouragement, sharing stories of similar experiences and voicing their hopes for a victory in David's case. And while there were still critics doubting the need for the lawsuit, David chose to focus on those who understood what he was fighting for. On the eve of the hearing, he sat in his office, reviewing the statements, the evidence, and the arguments they had built. Angela joined him, a quiet confidence in her eyes. "We're ready," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "No matter what they throw at us, we've done everything we can to prepare." David looked at her, feeling a deep gratitude for her unwavering support. We're not just fighting for a case, we're fighting for something much bigger than us. Angela nodded, a determined smile breaking across her face. Then let's make sure we win. As they sat together, finalizing the last details, David felt a sense of purpose settle over him. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, that Harrison and Lane would throw every obstacle they could muster in his path. But he also knew that he wasn't alone, and that together they were going to see this through to the end. In that moment, David made a promise to himself. No matter what it took, he would fight until justice was served. The courthouse was abuzz with activity on the morning of the pretrial hearing. David stood outside, taking a steadying breath as he looked up at the imposing building. The pressure was mounting. The weight of his case now felt like a boulder pressing down on his shoulders. This wasn't just about a single experience anymore. This was a fight that had taken on a life of its own, a challenge to an entire system that had been unchecked for too long. Angela joined him, handing him a sheaf of carefully prepared notes. "You ready for this?" she asked. Her expression resolute. David nodded, his jaw set. "I am. But I know Harrison and Lane are going to be brutal. They'll do whatever it takes to make this go away." Angela's gaze hardened. "And that's exactly why we won't back down. No matter what, we're going to make sure the truth is heard." Inside, the courtroom was filled with spectators, reporters, and a few familiar faces, colleagues from the legal community who had come to support him. And seated across the aisle were the airport's representatives, alongside Harrison and Lane's lead attorney, Charles Lane himself. Lane, an older man with a reputation for mercilessly dismantling cases just like David's, met David's gaze with a thin, cold smile before looking away. The judge called the court to order, and Lane wasted no time. He began with a statement that reeked of calculated contempt, calling the lawsuit an overblown response to a routine security check, meant to undermine the necessary procedures that keep our airports safe. He continued, his voice full of polished confidence. "Mr. Shaw claims that he was discriminated against, but there is no evidence to support this. My client, the Airport Security Agency, strictly adheres to federal protocols and is committed to the safety of all passengers, regardless of background or appearance. This case is nothing more than an attempt to smear the reputations of those who put their lives on the line every day." David felt his blood simmer, but he kept his expression neutral, letting Lane's words settle over the courtroom. He knew this was just the beginning. Lane's strategy was clear. He would try to diminish David's experience and make him appear paranoid, undermining the basis of the entire lawsuit. When it was Angela's turn to speak, she stood confidently, her voice unwavering. "This case isn't an attempt to undermine security. Mr. Shaw believes in the importance of safety protocols, as we all do, but these protocols must not be used as a shield for discrimination. What happened to Mr. Shaw was not routine. He was detained, questioned, and humiliated because of his appearance. Today, we're here to prove that." She outlined the timeline of events, detailing every unreasonable delay, every invasive question. With every word, she painted a picture of Pierce's behavior as anything but routine. David could see the judge listening intently, and a glimmer of hope sparked within him. But Lane wasn't finished. He rose to his feet, his tone condescending as he cross-examined David, questioning his version of events. "Mr. Shaw," Lane said, his voice dripping with skepticism, "you claim you were profiled based on your appearance, but isn't it true that you became visibly agitated during the security check?" David met Lane's gaze, his voice steady. "I was trying to catch a flight for a crucial case, Mr. Lane. The delays were unreasonable, and I was frustrated. But I complied with every request and answered every question they asked." Lane didn't miss a beat. "So you were frustrated, yet rather than cooperate fully, you chose to question Agent Pierce's authority. Is that correct?" David narrowed his eyes. "I questioned his reasoning because he refused to tell me why I was being detained. He implied that I was suspicious without any grounds to do so." Lane smirked, as if David had proven his point. "And your reaction was to argue with him, which could be seen as uncooperative. Security agents are trained to recognize behavior that might indicate a threat. Is it so hard to believe that your agitation could have been perceived as suspicious?" David's voice was calm but firm. "Being frustrated doesn't make someone a threat, Mr. Lane. And treating someone like a criminal for simply existing isn't security, it's profiling. Lane shrugged, giving the judge a look as if to say, "See, he's difficult." But David didn't flinch. He knew that Lane's tactic was to twist his emotions into a weapon against him, to portray him as a hostile figure who had provoked his own detention. When Lane finished, Angela brought forward her first witness, Grace Thompson, the woman who had been standing behind David in line that day. Grace was a retired schoolteacher with a calm, gentle presence, and as she took the stand, her testimony cut through the tension in the room. "I was standing right behind Mr. Shaw, and I watched everything that happened," she said firmly. "He was polite, answered all of their questions, and didn't raise his voice once. But that man, Agent Pierce, he kept pushing, as if he wanted Mr. Shaw to lose his temper." Lane immediately objected. "Speculation, Your Honor." The judge allowed Angela to rephrase, and Grace continued, unwavering. "What I'm saying is, Mr. Shaw was treated differently than anyone else in that line. I know because I was watching. There was nothing suspicious about him, and I didn't see any reason for the way he was treated." The weight of Grace's words hung in the air, resonating with those in the room. David felt a surge of gratitude for her courage in speaking out. Lane tried to poke holes in her account, but Grace stood firm, her testimony unwavering. Then it was time for Agent Lila Kim's testimony. When Lila took the stand, she appeared nervous, her eyes darting briefly to the back of the courtroom where a few airport security agents sat, watching her every move. But when she looked over at David, a glimmer of resolve steadied her. Angela approached her gently, aware of the pressure Lila was under. "Agent Kim, can you describe what you observed that day?" Lila took a deep breath. "I was assisting with routine checks when Agent Pierce pulled Mr. Shaw aside. I could tell that Mr. Shaw was cooperating, but Pierce kept questioning him about his job, his travel plans, even his hotel. It felt excessive. And it wasn't the first time I'd seen Pierce act that way." Angela's voice was soft but firm. "Can you elaborate on that, Agent Kim?" Lila hesitated, then nodded. "I've seen Agent Pierce single out passengers before, usually people who—" She paused, as if weighing her words. "People who don't look like they belong. It's subtle, but I've seen him apply different standards depending on someone's appearance." Lane immediately rose to object. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculation and hearsay." But the judge allowed her to continue, and Lila pressed on, her voice steady. "I didn't agree with how Mr. Shaw was treated. It didn't feel like standard protocol. It felt targeted." Angela offered Lila a reassuring nod as she finished her testimony, and David could feel the courtroom shifting. The power of Lila's words, the first-hand account from within airport security itself, struck a chord. When the court recessed, David felt a wave of relief and gratitude toward Lila. Her decision to speak up had been a courageous one, and it had given his case the credibility it needed. But he knew the fight was far from over. Over the next few days, David and Angela reviewed their strategy as Lane continued to push back, filing motions to dismiss key pieces of evidence and trying to undercut every piece of testimony in their favor. Meanwhile, the media coverage intensified, with more people sharing their own experiences of discrimination at airports, rallying behind David's case. But as the support grew, so did the criticism. Online forums, social media, and talk shows all seemed to buzz with debate. While many praised David's bravery, others accused him of seeking attention, of trying to undermine security in the name of political correctness. There were comments doubting his version of events, insinuating that he must have done something to deserve the treatment he received. One night, David sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through the comments online. Here we go again, another guy playing the race card. He felt a familiar sting, the bitter feeling that no matter how hard he fought, there would always be people who refused to see the truth. Angela called him, sensing his frustration. "David, don't let them get to you. They're just trying to distract you from the facts. We're here to make real change, and that doesn't come easy." He sighed, grateful for her encouragement. "I know, but sometimes it feels like they'll twist everything to avoid addressing the real issue." "Then we just keep pushing forward," Angela said, her voice firm. "We have facts on our side, and we have people like Lila and Grace willing to stand with us. The truth has a way of cutting through the noise." David nodded, steeling himself. You're right. This case isn't just about winning. It's about making sure people see what's really happening. The next day, David and Angela prepared for the upcoming trial, reviewing the evidence, statements, and cross-examination tactics. They were determined to expose the truth of what he had endured, and to show how deeply embedded biases had allowed people like Agent Pierce to operate unchecked. David felt his resolve solidify with every new piece of evidence they reviewed. This fight was no longer just his own. It was for everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or treated as less than, all because of someone else's prejudice. As they left the office late that night, Angela looked over at him, a glimmer of pride in her eyes. "We're almost there, David. They've done everything they can to stop us, and we're still standing." David met her gaze, feeling a fierce determination course through him. "Then let's make sure we finish this." In that moment, he knew he was ready for whatever lay ahead. He would see this fight through to the end. No matter how hard Harrison and Lane pushed, no matter how loud the critics became. Because this was bigger than him, it was about justice for everyone. And he wasn't going to stop until that justice was won. The weeks leading up to the trial were a blur of intense preparation. David and Angela pored over every detail of the case, refining their arguments, anticipating Lane's tactics, and double-checking every piece of evidence. As the trial loomed, they felt both the weight of the stakes and the simmering excitement of seeing justice so close within reach. Each night, David worked late into the hours, rehearsing his statements, familiarizing himself with every angle of the defense's arguments, and reminding himself why he'd started this fight in the first place. He knew Harrison and Lane would stop at nothing to protect their client, twisting truths, painting him as the aggressor, and trying to undermine his credibility. But David's resolve was firmer than ever. He had witnesses, first-hand accounts, and the courage to see this through, no matter the cost. One evening, just days before the trial, Angela entered David's office carrying a document, her face alight with news. "We got it," she said, handing him the paper. "The court ordered the airport to release the security footage. They stalled as long as they could, but they couldn't avoid it forever. The footage is finally ours." David took the document, his heart pounding. "This footage is our strongest evidence," he said, a surge of relief washing over him. "Once the jury sees what really happened, Pierce's treatment of me, his insistence on pushing me through endless questioning, they'll understand that this wasn't just a routine check." Angela nodded, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Exactly. This footage, combined with Grace's testimony and Lila's statement, will make it nearly impossible for Lane to twist the facts. They can only deflect so much when we have everything documented." They spent the following days analyzing the footage, marking each moment where Pierce's actions went beyond routine. There were clear moments when David had complied, only to be met with more invasive questions. The footage showed the discomfort of the other agents, including Lila, and the unmistakable, almost smug satisfaction on Pierce's face as he detained David without cause. It was exactly what they needed to expose the airport's biases and dismantle the defense's argument that Pierce was just following protocol. The night before the trial, Angela and David sat in the quiet of his office, going over their strategy one final time. The glow from his desk lamp cast a warm circle of light over the stacks of files and notes they had amassed. And in that moment, David felt a wave of gratitude for Angela's support. She had been his constant ally through every grueling hour of preparation, offering encouragement, insight, and the occasional push to keep him grounded. Angela gave him a reassuring smile. "David, you're ready. You've prepared yourself for every angle, every possible attack Lane could throw at you. Tomorrow, you get to tell your story, and we'll make sure it's heard." David nodded, taking a deep breath. "It's surreal, you know? After all the work, all the late nights, it's finally here. I just hope I can hold my ground." Angela's eyes softened. "You're doing more than that, David. You're fighting for every person who's ever been treated unfairly, and you're giving them a voice. Remember that when you're on that stand." He offered a grateful smile, feeling the weight of her words settle within him like a calm resolve. "I'll remember. Thank you, Angela, for everything." The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial, with rows of spectators, journalists, and David's colleagues from the legal community.
Reporters lined the back of the room, their cameras poised to capture every moment of the proceedings. David could feel the eyes of the world on him, but he pushed the pressure aside, focusing on the case he had built and the truth he was ready to reveal. Lane, as expected, opened with a strong attack. He painted David as uncooperative, insinuating that David's frustration had been aggressive and that his own behavior had escalated the situation. With his polished, confident tone, Lane wove a narrative that aimed to shift blame onto David, subtly suggesting that David had misinterpreted a simple security check as an act of prejudice. Mr. Shaw was clearly agitated, Lane said, addressing the jury with a smooth, practiced cadence. And while my client's agents have an obligation to ensure security, they were met with hostility and resistance. It's regrettable, but Mr. Shaw's own behavior contributed to the outcome. David felt his hands tighten as he listened. Lane's tactic was clear. Portray David as difficult, make him seem unyielding, and convince the jury that Pierce was simply responding to an uncooperative traveler. But David reminded himself that they had their own truth to tell. Angela rose for their opening argument, her voice clear and unwavering. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about hostility or resistance. It is about dignity, respect, and the basic human right to be treated fairly. Mr. Shaw complied with every procedure asked of him. He answered every question, and yet he was detained, questioned repeatedly, and treated as a threat, all because of who he was. We have evidence to show that Mr. Shaw was profiled, targeted, and singled out, not for his actions, but for his appearance. She outlined their case, detailing each instance of mistreatment, each question that went beyond standard protocol, and each action by Pierce that proved this was anything but routine. David watched as the jury listened, their expressions thoughtful, some even troubled. He could sense their attention shifting, the truth starting to cut through the defense's polished narrative. The next few days were a battle of testimonies. The defense brought forward several airport security agents who claimed that Pierce had been within his rights to question David. They described Pierce as a diligent, cautious officer who wouldn't overstep without reason. Lane, in his usual style, questioned each witness with precision, presenting Pierce as a model officer, a paragon of airport security. Then it was time for David to take the stand. He felt a surge of anxiety as he sat down, aware of every pair of eyes on him. Angela gave him an encouraging nod, and he steadied himself, focusing on his purpose. As he recounted the events of that day, he felt the anger and frustration rise within him, but he kept his voice calm, each word clear and measured. He described how Pierce's questions had grown more invasive, how his attempts to clarify the reasoning behind his detainment had been met with hostility, and how he had ultimately been led away as if he were a criminal. He could see the jury's reactions, their frowns deepening, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Lane, predictably, was ruthless in his cross-examination. He pressed David about every reaction, every word he had said to Pierce, twisting his responses to paint him as difficult. "Mr. Shaw," Lane said, his voice full of barely concealed disdain, "you were clearly agitated. Do you think that might have contributed to the situation escalating?" David met his gaze without flinching. "I was frustrated, yes, but I wasn't hostile, and I certainly didn't escalate the situation. I wanted to know why I was being detained without cause. That's not hostility. It's a request for basic respect." Lane's expression flickered, but he quickly covered it. "Respect is a two-way street, Mr. Shaw. Don't you think Agent Pierce deserved your respect, too?" David's response was firm, his voice unwavering. "Respect is earned, Mr. Lane, and treating someone unfairly, singling them out based on appearance, that isn't respect." Lane faltered, momentarily thrown off, but he quickly moved on. However, David could sense the impact his words had made. The jury was listening, and they were beginning to see through Lane's tactics. The turning point came when Angela presented the security footage. The courtroom was silent as the video played, capturing each moment of David's detainment with undeniable clarity. The jury watched as Pierce repeatedly questioned David, ignoring his compliance, pushing him further with invasive, baseless questions. They could see David's calm responses, his patience thinning only as Pierce continued to delay him, ultimately causing him to miss his flight. Then came Lila's testimony. She took the stand with quiet determination, her voice steady as she described Pierce's pattern of behavior, how she had witnessed him single out travelers based on appearance, her discomfort clear as she recounted her interactions with him. Lane attempted to discredit her, implying that she was biased against Pierce, but Lila stood her ground, each answer confident and resolute. "Agent Kim," Lane said, his voice dripping with skepticism, "are you implying that Agent Pierce, a man with years of experience, has a history of profiling?" Lila met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "Yes, Mr. Lane. I've seen him do it before, and I saw him do it again with Mr. Shaw." The courtroom was silent as her words sank in, and David felt a surge of gratitude for her courage. Her testimony, combined with the footage, was irrefutable. They had painted a clear, undeniable picture of Pierce's actions, a pattern of discrimination that even Lane couldn't twist. As the trial drew to a close, Angela gave their final statement, her voice filled with a quiet, powerful conviction. "This case is about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one is subjected to unfair treatment simply because of how they look. Mr. Shaw is here not only to seek justice for himself, but to prevent others from facing the same injustice. We urge you to consider the evidence, the testimonies, and the truth that has been presented. This is our chance to say enough is enough." The courtroom fell into a tense silence as Angela took her seat. David could feel the weight of their case resting on the jury's shoulders, the outcome hanging in the balance. As the judge dismissed the court, David took a deep breath, feeling both exhausted and hopeful. He glanced at Angela, who gave him a reassuring smile. "We've done everything we could, David," she said quietly. "Now it's up to them." David nodded, feeling the gravity of her words. He had fought with everything he had, shared his truth, and laid bare the injustice he'd endured. Now, all he could do was wait and hope that justice would prevail. The jury deliberated for 3 long, agonizing days. During that time, David felt as though his life had been suspended in midair, as if everything he'd worked for, every sleepless night, and every sacrifice, hung by a single thread. Angela stayed close by his side, maintaining a steady front even as doubt and anxiety simmered just beneath the surface. On the morning of the verdict, David sat in his office, alone, hands clasped as he gazed out the window. A mix of emotions ran through him: hope, fear, a hint of exhaustion. Win or lose, he knew the case had taken a piece of him, leaving behind a person forever changed by the fight for justice. Angela knocked softly on the door and entered, her expression calm but her eyes conveying the same nervous anticipation he felt. "They've reached a verdict," she said. David's heart pounded as he nodded. "All right, let's go." The courtroom was filled with an electric silence as David took his seat, glancing around at the faces of the jurors who held his fate in their hands. Reporters crowded the back of the room, their cameras and notebooks ready to capture the outcome of the high-profile trial that had gripped the public's attention. Lane sat across from him, his demeanor calm but his face unreadable. He offered David a tight, professional nod, as if to acknowledge the tenacity of his opponent. David returned the nod, sensing the odd, quiet respect that had developed between them. Lane was ruthless, but he'd been pushed harder than he had likely anticipated, and David could tell that even Lane wasn't entirely sure which way this verdict would fall. The judge entered, and everyone rose to their feet before taking their seats. The foreperson, a woman with graying hair and a grave expression, stood to read the verdict. David's pulse thundered in his ears, each word carrying the weight of months of struggle, sacrifice, and unwavering determination. In the case of Shaw versus Airport Security Agency and Agent John Pierce, the foreperson began, her voice steady. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. David Shaw." A wave of relief surged through David. The verdict wasn't just a personal victory. It was a resounding affirmation that his fight had been just and his cause was worth the struggle. He felt Angela's hand clasp his shoulder, her smile wide, a mixture of pride and triumph in her eyes. The tension he'd held in his chest finally released, and he allowed himself to breathe deeply, relishing the feeling of justice, however hard-won it had been. But the foreperson wasn't finished. We, the jury, find that the defendants, Airport Security Agency, and Agent John Pierce, are liable for racial profiling, unlawful detainment, and emotional distress. We recommend that the agency institute immediate policy reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. The judge nodded, a stern expression on his face as he addressed the court. This case has brought to light serious issues within our security protocols and the power given to those who enforce them. I echo the jury's recommendation that the airport and its agents undergo substantial policy reform to address and prevent instances of racial discrimination. With that, the judge banged the gavel, signaling the end of the trial. David closed his eyes, feeling the weight of everything. The hardship, the anger, the patience, all dissolve in that moment of resolution. When he looked around, he saw supportive faces, nodding in approval and whispering to one another about the courage he had shown in the face of adversity. Lane stood, offering his hand across the aisle. David accepted it, the two men exchanging a firm handshake. "Well fought, Shaw," Lane said, a note of reluctant respect in his voice. "You've proven your point." David nodded. "Thank you. I hope you'll remember it." Lane gave a brief smile before leaving the courtroom with his team, his composure unbroken. Angela leaned close, her voice brimming with pride. "David, we did it. We actually did it." He gave her a small, exhausted smile. "No, Angela, you did it. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Angela chuckled, waving him off. "It was all you, David. I just helped you find your voice." As they left the courtroom together, they were met with a wall of flashing cameras and reporters shouting questions. David raised a hand to quiet the noise, then took a step forward, ready to address the crowd. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the eyes of countless people who had watched his fight from afar. "This case," David began, his voice strong despite the fatigue, "was about more than just one person's experience. It was about dignity, respect, and the need to ensure that every person is treated fairly, no matter who they are. Today's verdict is a victory for anyone who has ever been unfairly judged or discriminated against. But let's be clear, this fight isn't over. There are still systems and practices that must change, and I intend to see those changes through." Reporters bombarded him with questions about the reform recommendations, about Agent Pierce, about his next steps. David answered each question with calm conviction, sharing his commitment to ensuring that the airport and security agencies across the country take meaningful steps to address the biases that had led to his own ordeal. One reporter asked, "Mr. Shaw, do you believe this case could inspire broader changes in the way airport security is conducted?" David met her gaze, his voice unwavering. "That's exactly what I hope. This case isn't just about my experience. It's about creating a precedent that makes racial profiling and discrimination unacceptable anywhere. This isn't the end of my fight for justice. It's only the beginning." In the days following the verdict, David's case dominated news cycles across the nation. His victory became a rallying point for activists and advocates, many of whom reached out to express their solidarity and gratitude. His inbox was flooded with messages of support from strangers and colleagues alike, sharing stories of their own experiences with racial profiling and thanking him for standing up when they couldn't. And true to the jury's recommendation, the airport was forced to implement immediate reforms. Training programs were revised, policies reevaluated, and mandatory bias awareness courses instituted for all security personnel. The airport also issued an official statement acknowledging the court's findings and pledging to take concrete steps to prevent future incidents of discrimination. But for David, the victory felt bittersweet. He had won, yes, but he couldn't shake the sense that his fight was only beginning. The case had illuminated a problem that ran far deeper than one security checkpoint, one airport, or one man's experience. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, that the systems that allowed people like Pierce to thrive needed continuous pressure to reform. One morning, as he sat in his office, he received a call from Agent Lila Kim. "Mr. Shaw," she began, her voice tentative, "I just wanted to say thank you. I don't think I ever really got the chance to tell you that." Standing up there, testifying, "It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I'm glad I did it." David smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude for her courage. "Thank you, Lila. Without you, this this case would have been a lot harder to win. I know it wasn't easy, but you helped bring justice to light. You helped change things." She hesitated, then replied, "It's strange, you know? I spent years just going along with things, afraid to speak up. But you reminded me that some fights are worth taking risks for." They spoke for a few more minutes before she said goodbye, and as David hung up, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Lila's words had reminded him of why he'd started this journey and why he couldn't stop now. That afternoon, he met with Angela to discuss the next steps. As they sat across from each other, he shared his vision for continuing the work they'd started with this case. "Angela," he said, "we need to do more. We need to expand this into something larger. Maybe a coalition, a group dedicated to challenging and reforming discriminatory practices across all sectors. Not just in airports, but everywhere." Angela's eyes lit up. "You're talking about a civil rights initiative, a watchdog organization for institutional accountability." "David, that's brilliant." They spent the rest of the afternoon brainstorming, ideas flowing freely as they began sketching out the foundation for what would become a movement. David envisioned an organization that could provide legal support for victims of discrimination, that could advocate for policy reform, and that could bring issues of racial bias to the forefront of public consciousness. As the sun began to set, Angela looked at him, pride shining in her eyes. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" David nodded, a sense of quiet determination settling over him. "Yes, we've won one battle, but the war for justice is far from over." They shook hands, sealing their commitment to the next phase of the fight. And as David left the office that night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that he was no longer fighting just for himself. His case had become a beacon, a call to action, and he was ready to lead the way forward. For every person who had been made to feel small, who had been silenced or dismissed, he would continue to fight until true justice was within reach for all. The days following the verdict felt surreal. David had achieved justice, but he knew his journey was far from over. The victory in court had shifted something in him, awakening a deeper purpose that felt larger and more urgent than anything he had imagined. The case had become a national conversation, and the fight against racial profiling and institutional bias was now on the front page of nearly every newspaper in the country. David's phone never stopped buzzing. Messages of support flooded in from old colleagues, activists, law students, and even strangers who saw in his fight a mirror of their own experiences. He could sense the collective sigh of relief from people across the nation who'd faced discrimination without a platform to speak out or an ally to stand by them. And the victory reverberated far beyond his personal circles. Major organizations reached out, eager to partner with him to address similar injustices in other sectors. The change was undeniable, and David knew it was time to do more than celebrate his own victory. It was time to turn his personal battle into a catalyst for widespread reform. David was in the middle of organizing his thoughts on the movement he wanted to start when Angela walked into his office, her face bright with excitement. "David, you're going to want to see this," she said, holding up her tablet. On the screen was an announcement from the airport. The agency had released an official statement listing several policy changes that would be implemented in response to the verdict. The reforms included mandatory bias training, regular performance reviews, and a new policy to protect passengers' rights during screenings. "They're finally taking responsibility," Angela said, a note of pride in her voice. "Your case forced them to acknowledge what they've been doing and to make changes. You did that, David." David nodded, letting her words sink in. "It's a good start," he said thoughtfully. "But one case won't change the entire system. We need a sustainable force behind this, something that ensures these changes happen at every level, in every institution where power is misused." Angela grinned, already knowing where his mind was headed. "That's why we're here, right? To keep pushing. We're just getting started." That evening, David and Angela met at a small cafe to finalize their plans for what they had tentatively called the Justice Alliance. They envisioned a non-profit organization that would provide legal aid to victims of discrimination, advocate for policy changes in law enforcement and corporate institutions, and educate the public on recognizing and challenging bias in all forms. They sketched out their plans on napkins, laughing at the absurdity of building a national movement on the back of a restaurant table. But as the hours passed, they realized they were creating something real, something powerful that could outlive them both. Their mission became clear. They would be a voice for the voiceless, a force that held powerful institutions accountable and empowered everyday people to stand up for their rights. Angela looked at him across the table, her eyes filled with pride. "This is going to change everything, David. It won't be easy, but I believe in this. I believe in you." David took a deep breath, his resolve stronger than ever. "Then let's make it happen." The next week, David and Angela officially launched the Justice Alliance, announcing it to the media and legal community in a press conference. They were met with a flood of interest from journalists and supporters who saw in the alliance a promise of hope and change. Social media buzzed with hashtags, and donations poured in from people who wanted to be part of the fight. Their team quickly grew, with law students, activists, and legal experts joining their cause, each bringing their own passion for justice. David and Angela recruited civil rights attorneys from across the country, offering pro bono legal support for cases of racial discrimination, wrongful detainment, and other abuses of power. Within months, the Justice Alliance had become a movement. Their first major case after the airport victory came from a young man named Andre Fields, who had been wrongfully detained and harassed by the police during a traffic stop. He was a college student, on his way to an exam when he was pulled over and detained without cause. Andre had reached out to the Justice Alliance after hearing about David's fight, hoping for someone to take his story seriously. Angela handled the intake meeting with Andre, her heart heavy as he recounted his experience. "They accused me of hiding something," he said, his voice shaking with frustration. "They kept me in cuffs for an hour, making me late for my exam, and then just let me go. No reason. They just said I looked nervous." David listened intently, the injustice of it all reigniting his determination. "Andre, we're going to take your case," he promised. "You deserve justice, and we're going to make sure you get it." Over the next few weeks, David and Angela worked tirelessly on Andre's case, filing a lawsuit against the local police department for wrongful detainment and harassment. They drew upon the momentum from David's own case, using it as an example of how accountability could lead to institutional change. The trial for Andre's case attracted national attention, with people rallying behind him, and in time, the verdict came in his favor. The court found that the police had acted without cause, and Andre was awarded damages for the emotional distress he had endured. The police department was also ordered to implement new training programs and procedural changes. As they celebrated the victory with Andre and his family, David felt a sense of fulfillment that ran even deeper than his own case. This was why he had started the Justice Alliance, to give people like Andre the strength and support to fight back, to ensure that no one else had to suffer in silence. Angela looked over at him as they walked out of the courthouse. "This is it, David. We're making a difference, one case at a time." David smiled, his heart full. "And we're just getting started." In the months that followed, the Justice Alliance took on more cases, advocating for individuals facing discrimination in workplaces, schools, and public spaces. They became a beacon for justice, a force that refused to back down in the face of opposition. With each victory, their influence grew, and soon, they were fielding calls from across the country, from people who had stories to tell, from people who needed help. The Alliance became more than just a legal nonprofit. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that people could fight back against injustice and win. They launched workshops and community outreach programs, teaching people about their rights and how to stand up for themselves. Their impact spread, slowly but surely changing the landscape of civil rights across the nation. One evening, as David was packing up his office after a long day, he received a call from a familiar number. It was Lila Kim. "Mr. Shaw," she began, her voice bright with excitement. "I wanted to let you know that the changes at the airport are real. They're actually following through. The training has started, and there's a different atmosphere. People are being held accountable. You did that." David felt a swell of gratitude. "No, Lila. We did that. Thank you for standing up. Without you, none of this would have been possible." They spoke for a few more minutes before she hung up, and as David set down the phone, he felt the weight of everything they had accomplished. The Alliance was making waves, and it was thanks to people like Lila, people who had taken risks, stood up, and said, "Enough." Angela entered his office, giving him an approving nod. Lila, right? He smiled. She called to tell me that the airport is actually implementing changes. It's working, Angela. She nodded, a proud smile spreading across her face. I told you. You're making a difference. David leaned back, a rare moment of peace settling over him. He thought of every person he'd encountered in this journey, every story he'd heard, and every fight they'd fought together. There would always be challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like justice wasn't just a dream. It was a reality he was helping to build. That night, David left the office with a sense of purpose that was deeper and stronger than ever before. He knew the journey was far from over, and that there would be more battles to face, more voices to amplify, and more systems to challenge. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. With Angela by his side, the support of his community, and the strength of the Justice Alliance, he was ready for whatever lay ahead. As he walked through the quiet city streets, he felt the weight of a promise he'd made long ago. A promise to fight for those who couldn't, to stand up when others were afraid, and to bring justice to places where it had been absent for far too long. In that moment, David knew he was right where he was meant to be, and that no matter what the future held, he would continue to fight. Because true justice wasn't just a victory in court. It was a promise he would keep alive, a legacy that would endure, one case, one voice, one life at a time. Months passed, and the Justice Alliance grew from a fledgling nonprofit into a powerful force, challenging institutional discrimination in sectors beyond airport security. Every case they took on gained momentum, shining a light on systemic biases and holding organizations accountable in ways that felt long overdue. Word spread quickly, and it wasn't long before the Alliance was fielding cases from across the nation, each one as urgent and important as David's own experience had been. David often worked late into the night, reviewing new cases with Angela and strategizing ways to increase the Alliance's reach. It was grueling work, but every victory reaffirmed their purpose, and every victory was a reminder of the people whose lives they were helping to rebuild. One brisk fall morning, David received a letter from the National Civil Rights Commission. It was an invitation to speak at their upcoming annual conference on civil rights and institutional reform. The conference was known as one of the most respected platforms for activists, legal experts, and policy advocates, and an invitation to speak was a powerful acknowledgement of the Alliance's impact. When David shared the news with Angela, her face broke into a wide smile. This is huge, David. The conference has representatives from federal agencies, major corporations, lawmakers, and community leaders from across the country. If there was ever a time to showcase the work we're doing, this is it. David felt a surge of pride and gratitude. It's not just about me. It's about the people we've fought for and everyone who's believed in us. I want to make sure we give them a voice on that stage. Over the following weeks, David poured his energy into crafting a speech that would convey the importance of their work. He wanted his words to resonate with those in power and to remind them of their duty to the people they served. More than anything, he wanted to inspire others to join the fight for justice, to challenge them to make accountability and fairness a part of the fabric of every institution. The night of the conference arrived, and David felt a familiar blend of nerves and excitement as he took the stage. Angela sat in the front row, watching with a proud, encouraging smile, while hundreds of people filled the auditorium, eager to hear from the man whose fight for justice had sparked a national conversation. David cleared his throat, letting the silence settle as he looked out over the audience. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I stand before you tonight not as a lawyer or an activist, but as someone who experienced injustice firsthand. I was detained and humiliated, not because of any threat I posed, but because of assumptions made about who I am. That experience was painful, but it also gave me purpose. It taught me that we, as a society, have a responsibility to hold our institutions accountable and to ensure they serve every person with dignity and respect." The audience listened intently as David continued, his words flowing with conviction and clarity. "We created the Justice Alliance because too many people in this country live in fear of discrimination. Too many feel powerless against institutions that are meant to protect them, but that sometimes serve as a source of harm. I've seen the power of standing together, of creating change through courage and conviction, and I believe that together, We can build a future where justice is not a privilege but a guarantee. David paused, letting his words sink in. He could see the impact on the audience's faces, the intensity of their gaze, the nods of agreement. But this is only the beginning, he continued. Justice is not a one-time victory. It's a constant fight, a commitment we must make every day. And that commitment doesn't just belong to activists and attorneys. It belongs to each of you, to everyone who holds a position of power, who has the influence to make decisions. We're counting on you to make a difference, to ensure that every policy, every protocol, serves the people it claims to protect. The audience burst into applause as David stepped back from the podium, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. His words had found their mark, and as he looked out at the audience, he knew he'd planted the seeds of change. After the speech, David was approached by several key figures, representatives from government agencies, CEOs of major corporations, and leaders of nonprofit organizations. They spoke of partnerships, shared goals, and visions for reform. They expressed admiration for the Justice Alliance and voiced their willingness to collaborate on future cases and initiatives. One of them, Dr. Eleanor Reed, the head of a prominent human rights organization, shook his hand firmly. David, what you're doing is remarkable. We've been advocating for police reform for years, but it's people like you, with first-hand experience and legal expertise, who make the movement real and tangible. I'd love to discuss ways we can work together on future projects. David nodded, feeling the gravity of her words. Thank you, Dr. Reed. This work is personal for me, and it's heartening to see so many others ready to stand with us. Let's make it happen. The energy in the room was electric. Angela joined him as he spoke with more people, each conversation sparking new ideas, collaborations, and projects. Together, they were building something powerful, a coalition of advocates dedicated to creating lasting change. A few days later, David and Angela were back in the Alliance's office, going over their latest cases and discussing the new opportunities that had come from the conference. The Alliance had grown in size, adding attorneys, researchers, and volunteers eager to join their mission. They were now taking on cases nationwide, from workplace discrimination to unjust evictions and racially motivated traffic stops. One afternoon, as they reviewed a particularly challenging case, David received a message from Grace Thompson, the elderly woman who had testified as a witness in his own case months ago. She'd sent him a short, heartfelt email, congratulating him on the growth of the Alliance and thanking him once more for giving her the chance to be part of his journey. David read the message aloud to Angela, feeling the warmth of her words wash over him. It's people like Grace who remind me why we're doing this, he said, a soft smile on his face. She didn't have to testify. She could have walked away, but she chose to help. Angela nodded, her expression thoughtful. And because she did, we're here now. She gave us the foundation we needed to fight back. And now it's our turn to give others the same courage. Over the next several months, the Justice Alliance expanded its reach, creating partnerships with grassroots organizations across the country and establishing chapters in cities that had been hotspots for discrimination. Each chapter worked with local communities, providing legal support and educating people on their rights. They organized town hall meetings, spoke at community events, and launched online campaigns to spread awareness about systemic injustices. David and Angela made it a point to be involved in every aspect of the organization, often traveling to different states to meet with local leaders and hear firsthand from the people they were fighting for. They spent hours listening to people's stories, learning about the unique challenges each community faced, and working together to find solutions that were both empowering and transformative. One evening, David found himself in a small, crowded meeting hall in a rural town in Mississippi. He'd come to speak to a group of community leaders who were dealing with rampant housing discrimination. As he listened to each person's story, the unfair evictions, the unkept promises from landlords, the blatant racial biases, it hit him again just how important the Alliance's work had become. After the meeting, a young woman approached him, her eyes bright with hope. "Mr. Shaw, thank you for coming all the way here. For so long, we felt like nobody cared, like nobody was listening. But because of you and the Alliance, we feel seen. We feel like we matter." David felt a lump rise in his throat as he took her hand, gratitude and humility filling him. "Thank you. This work isn't just mine. It belongs to all of us. And we won't stop until everyone has a fair shot at justice. Back at the Alliance's headquarters, David and Angela held a celebration with their team to mark their one-year anniversary. The office buzzed with laughter and conversation, the air thick with camaraderie and the satisfaction of hard-won victories. Angela raised a glass, calling the room to attention. Here's to David and his vision, to every person who has believed in this mission, and to each of you who has poured your heart and soul into this work. Together, we're making the world a fairer place, one case at a time. David lifted his glass, his voice filled with emotion. To all of you, and to everyone who has stood up for what's right. This is just the beginning. The work ahead is daunting, but I couldn't ask for better people to fight alongside. Let's keep going. For justice. The room erupted in cheers, and as David looked around, he saw the faces of people he had come to consider family. People who shared his vision, who believed in the power of justice, and who were committed to building a world where dignity and respect were not just ideals, but realities. That night, as David left the office, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The road ahead was long, but with the support of the Alliance and the strength of the people they served, he knew they were unstoppable. The journey that had started with his own experience of discrimination had transformed into a movement that was changing lives, challenging institutions, and giving a voice to the voiceless. As he walked through the quiet city streets, David knew that he would continue this fight for as long as it took. Because justice was more than a victory in court, it was a legacy that he was building, one that he hoped would inspire generations to come. And as he looked up at the stars, he made a silent promise to himself and to everyone who had stood by him. He would never stop fighting for a world where everyone had the chance to be seen, heard, and treated with the respect they deserved. A year passed, and the impact of the Justice Alliance reverberated across the nation. What had begun as a response to David's own ordeal had grown into a powerful movement, addressing injustices that had been overlooked for far too long. The Alliance had become a trusted ally in the fight against systemic discrimination, with chapters springing up in cities across the United States. From housing discrimination and workplace harassment to wrongful arrests and racial profiling, the Justice Alliance was confronting biases and abuses wherever they surfaced. David had become a well-known figure in the fight for civil rights, a reluctant but powerful symbol of resistance and resilience. His days were filled with speaking engagements, meetings with policymakers, and overseeing the Alliance's many projects. But amid all the growth and the movement's success, he remained rooted in his original purpose: to empower people, to give them the tools to stand up for their rights, and to change the systems that had oppressed so many for so long. One afternoon, as David was reviewing a new case with Angela, he received an unexpected call. It was from Agent Lila Kim, the security officer who had testified in his own case and who had ultimately become a whistleblower for the airport's internal biases. David hadn't heard from her since she transferred to another department, a choice she'd made to distance herself from the fallout of the trial. "Mr. Shaw," she began, her voice warm yet hesitant. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Lila," he replied, smiling, "you're always welcome to interrupt. How are you?" There was a pause before she continued. "I'm doing well. And I wanted to thank you again. After the trial, I felt like I was finally able to be honest, not just with others but with myself. Your courage reminded me that silence is just as harmful as discrimination itself. I'm working with my new department to create training programs to address racial bias head-on. It's a start, but it feels right." David felt a surge of pride. "You're doing exactly what the world needs more of, taking a stand, even when it's hard. I'm proud of you, Lila." They spoke for a few more minutes, and when they ended the call, David leaned back in his chair, reflecting on how far they'd both come. The impact of his own case hadn't ended in the courtroom. It had planted seeds of change that were beginning to flourish in ways he could never have foreseen. That evening, David was invited to an awards ceremony, where he would be honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award for his work with the Justice Alliance. Angela joined him, her eyes shining with pride as they walked into the packed auditorium. Faces from every corner of his life were there: his family, former colleagues, clients whose cases the Alliance had taken on, and people who had been affected by their work. The ceremony began with speeches from leaders in the civil rights community who spoke about the alliance's influence and the ways it had inspired change. Then, when it was David's turn to speak, he walked to the podium, feeling the weight of their expectations, but also the immense gratitude he held for each person who had supported the journey. "Thank you," he began, his voice full of emotion. "I'm standing here tonight because of people like you, because of those who have been willing to challenge injustice and who believe in the possibility of change." The Justice Alliance was built on one simple idea, that every person deserves dignity, respect, and equality. And tonight, we celebrate not just one man's story, but the countless lives we have touched together. He paused, looking out at the faces of those who had helped shape the alliance, his voice softening as he continued. "But let's be clear, the work isn't over. There are still institutions that need reform, voices that need amplifying, and systems that need breaking and rebuilding. I accept this honor tonight not as a conclusion, but as a reminder that our work for justice and equality will never be complete. It's a commitment we must renew every day." The audience erupted in applause, and David stepped back from the podium, his heart full. Angela met him with a proud smile as he returned to his seat. "You always know just what to say," she whispered. He smiled. "I just speak the truth." The next day, David returned to his office with a renewed sense of purpose. He found himself reflecting on the journey that had led him here, the encounters, the victories, the sacrifices, and the lives that had been touched. He knew that the Alliance had achieved incredible things, but he also knew that he wanted its impact to continue beyond his own involvement. He wanted